Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the IPAF webinar entitled Developing a MEWP Safe Use Program and Supervisor Training. I am Stacy with IPAF North America, and I will be one of today's moderators. I have placed all participants on mute so that the presenter can be clearly heard. If you do have a question at any time during the presentation, please type it in the Q&A feature on the left-hand corner of your screen. Only the presenter and myself will be able to see those questions, and we will address questions towards the end of the presentation. Lastly, I do want to let you know that we are recording this webinar, and it will be available online shortly after the presentation. Tony Grote is Development Manager for IPAF North America. He is accountable for developing the growth of the association in the North American market. The association promotes the safe and effective use of powered access equipment, including aerial lifts and mast climbers. Tony, thank you for joining us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stacy, and welcome everyone. As Stacy stated, today we will be doing a presentation on the new ANSI A92.22 standard, specifically addressing the development requirements for a MEWP-specific, MEWP, specific safe use program and corresponding supervisory training. Today's presentation is a benefit provided by the IPAF North American Regional Council, where we will provide ongoing free webinars to our members to provide a level of inexpensive education to all of your employees. So it's easy enough to just click into the webinar, no travel, and just the time to participate is all that's required on your part to participate in the range of topics. So as these emails are coming out, if you have not received an email about this or it's not getting through to the right people, let us know by just emailing either Stacy or myself, and we'll make sure that you are added to the communications. So with that said, we're going to proceed with the presentation. So as I stated, the new safe use standard is within the suite of standards. There's a design, safe use, and training standard, and this standard specifies requirements for the application, inspection, training, maintenance, repair, and safe operation of mobile elevated work platforms, or MEWPs, which you'll hear the term MEWPs be used at times, which is equivalent to AWPs. And it applies to all of the aerial work platforms that are designed and manufactured under the A92.20 design standard. So specifically, what would be outside of this standard are those machines that are manufactured at A92.2, which are vehicle-mounted aerial work platforms. So those of you who have been involved with IPAF over the years, you're familiar already with MEWP categories. And these categories are associated with groups and types. There's groups A and B and types 1, 2, and 3. And the groups are defined by the platform in relationship to its chassis. So vertical lifts go right over the chassis, whereas boom type lifts, the platform will extend beyond the tipping point of the chassis. And types 1, 2, 3 are in relationship to the machine's mobility when the machine is in the elevated position. Whereas a type 1, we will call it a static machine, so it is not drivable when the platform is elevated. And type 3 are those that are drivable when the platform is in the elevated position. And the combination of the group and type, 1A, 1B, 3A, 3B, really lay out the four basic categories that are in place. I do reference that there is a type 2, which is similar to type 3s, but they have the ability to have the actual driving controls on the chassis. And a underbridge inspection device is an example of a type 2 type machine. So what are the user responsibilities? And so when we first get out to it, a user is anybody who basically has an employee who is going to operate an aerial work platform. And again, the standard specifies that the user has requirements for the application, inspection, training, maintenance, repair, and safe operation of the equipment. So within the standard, if you go through and you read the standard, there are 48 specific requirements where it says the user shall, and shall means you must do these things, where should is a recommendation, still highly referenced as something that you are highly suggested to perform. Of the 48 requirements, there are 19 that say that user shall ensure. So while the user itself has the responsibility to make sure it's done, sometimes it's done by the operator or by a supervisor, some other employee of that party. Throughout that standard, there are also 213 shalls within the standard that are requirements that apply to anyone who's performing a specific task. So if you are an owner of the equipment, there are shalls in there. You shall be doing these, like an annual inspection as an example. So depending upon what your role is, there are a lot of requirements within the standard, and you need to make sure that if you are an employer or a supervisor, that you know what these things are so that you can make sure that they're done. So the one thing that I would state to everybody, which is the focus of this presentation, is that if you do not have a MEWP specific safe use program, you aren't ready to comply with these standards. And by that, really what I'm stating to you is the standard itself requires that every user develop a MEWP specific safe use program. So looking at that, the question would be is, well, what is the safe use program? And there are a multitude of elements, tasks, that are incorporated within the standard, and I would summarize that those specific tasks really incorporate all of the elements within both the safe use and training standards. So you need to make sure that you create it and have it so that you know that somewhere along the line your program will be addressing the issues that are requirements within the standard. The basic elements that you have in there are risk assessments, which is identifying potential hazards on the job site and identifying the tasks that need to be done. And when you complete that, then you can do the equipment selection to perform the task. Along the way, you'll have the site assessment, preparation, maintenance. So I got to get this equipment in there. Will it fit into the job site? Is the ground conditions appropriate for what's doing it? As a job changes, I need to make sure that I'm maintaining it so that it can continue to support the work that needs to be done. You need to make sure that when you select the equipment that your people are properly trained. You need to make sure that that equipment is maintained, inspected, and repaired. When you're training an operator with a mobile elevator work platform, you also need to make sure that they are familiarized with the specific model that you have. When you're doing this risk assessment, you need to understand that there are other people involved and potentially exposed to potential hazards when you're using this. So as an example, if you're out on a public road or you're on a public sidewalk, the general public can be exposed to potential hazards, and you need to make sure that your plan incorporates the safety of others. You need to make sure that the equipment that is on site is secured in a way that you prevent unauthorized use. You need to communicate site-specific requirements that may be specific to your job and unique to your job that wouldn't be covered in general training, and that you need to have trained supervisors, and those trained supervisors evaluate your operators on an ongoing basis for proficiency, and that you document all the things that are required within the program. So as you can see, there's a lot, and we're going to go through these individual tasks one by one. But when we back into this, the real issue is why even do this? What's the value of doing this? What's my return on investment? So one thing that we look at as IPAF is we do accident data evaluations. And obviously the purpose of the standards is to prevent accidents. So when we have to do a risk assessment, the other thing you need to do is understand what are those potential hazards that are out there that I should know about, that I should be protecting my people against. So when we're looking at accident statistics in general, 1 of 5 or 20% of fatal workplace accidents are in the construction industry. And there are multiple times non-fatal accidents that cost millions of dollars to our industry. The leading cause for fatalities are being struck by an object, electrocutions, being caught in something or between objects. And those themselves account for almost 60% of all construction worker fatalities. Companies with 10 or fewer employees, or those who are self-employed, account for nearly half of all deaths in the construction industry. So if you're dealing with, or you are a company who's small in size, understand that the infrastructure that you have in place needs to be able to consider what are the risks and how are you going to mitigate those. And the construction industry as itself sees non-fatal injury rates that are 71% higher than any other industry. And 1 of every 10 construction workers will be involved in an injury annually. As IPAF looks at mobile elevated work platform accidents specifically, as opposed to OSHA looking at all accidents, which is really what the prior slide showed, when we're looking at those elements that are part of fatal accidents associated with mobile elevated work platforms, we have falls for the platform. So someone is actually falling outside of that platform to the ground. Overturns, where the machine itself tips over. Electrocutions, entrapments, which they're stuck between the guardrails of the machine and some overhead object, hit by a vehicle or other object, and mechanical or technical issues. So those elements are there, and if you go back to really what's part of that safe use program, we're going over there, we're saying the proper selection of the equipment, making sure your people are trained, making sure that the equipment is serviced. So all of the elements that are causes for accidents need to be considerations for that safe use program. And it all starts with the risk assessment. So while the new standard has a very detailed scope on a risk assessment and the procedures for completing one, know that it's always been within OSHA and within all of our prior standards that you need to identify the potential hazards associated with the equipment. And you do that through a risk assessment. So it's site-specific to the test that's being performed, and it really has to incorporate the location and timing. So as an example, if you're working in the great Northeast in New York in the wintertime or in the summertime or in the fall, the conditions can vary based on just the timing of when the work is being done. What's the weather? What are the ground conditions? So all of those elements need to be part of your thinking when you're doing your risk assessments and incorporated into that planning. And while you create this plan, and you can see that this thing can be, a pretty voluminous document depending upon how complex the work that you're doing is, when you're communicating with your workers, the real issue is keep it simple. So when you're looking at, the fundamentals of working safely, the 3 basic causes that they'll summarize them into is I didn't see it, I didn't think about it, or I didn't know. So when you're communicating with the operators of these equipment, the people who are on the job site, they don't need to read the thesis of a safe use program, but they need to have the safe use elements that they can apply to that job site. So once you've completed your risk assessment, you said, okay, here's all the potential risks that are out there, then you have to get through the selection, securing, and use of the suitable mobile elevated work platform and the work equipment associated with it. So as you're looking at some of these pictures that are on site, you see our animation picture there that shows a guy standing on top of a ladder. obviously an application where they didn't have the right piece of equipment for the job. They didn't have one that would go up high enough to reach the job. And you're looking at all of the pictures that you see there. There's a wide range of both sites and equipment that would be optimum for performing the task. And you need to be aware of what those options are that will fill the requirements for your job and the task that you're performing. So, if you're painting or you're installing large sheets of cladding, one is, well, I have this paintbrush and a bucket of paint, and the other one I have these sheets that may be 10, 12 feet long. That will help define, the type of equipment that you need to properly perform that task. So again, I go back to the selection of it. We have MEWP categories. So you end up having the basic categories of 1A, 1B, 3A, and 3Bs. And as I said, we do have the 2B category as well. And when we're looking at the selection, you also need to keep in mind that the selection within this plan needs to take into account the appropriate work equipment associated with the operation. So, what are the PPE requirements? Personal fall protection. Do we need hard hats and steel-toed shoes and gloves and hearing protection and goggles? Obviously, personal fall protection. And then, are there accessories out in the marketplace that are available for you? And then the things that are taking into account protection of others, things like warning cones, flagmen, and signals. So all of those elements are additionally part of this planning that you need to take place. And then when we select the equipment, we're going in and saying, okay, we end up having the access, preparation, and maintenance of the site as required. And that has to include the assessment that the support surface is adequate to support the weight of the mobile elevated work platform. So here you can see, a picture where someone went over and selected a lift driving down a sidewalk, and they had a vault underneath it, and they didn't take into consideration the weight of that. Now, again, your risk assessment has to take place in part of the selection of the equipment. Will the surface that I'm working on take care of supporting this load? And you don't want to make the assumption that your operators, once you've selected the equipment, are structural engineers and they have that knowledge. So the risk assessment is something that takes place before the equipment is selected and before the operator is selected. So it is something that is assumed is done and addressed properly before the work begins. Then when you get the equipment on the site, you need to make sure that all of the appropriate maintenance, inspections, and repairs are done. And when you're looking at the standards, you have scheduled maintenance, pre-delivery inspections. So depending upon whether you're the owner of the equipment or you are someone who's renting the equipment, the boxes that you're going to tick on this list may change, or you may have all of them. So we have frequent inspections that are done every 3 months, annual inspections done annually, pre-start inspections, which are done daily by the operator, but the user is responsible to make sure that they're done by the operator, maintenance and repair training. So again, look at that word training in there. So if someone's maintaining it, they also have to have the knowledge to understand how to work on that particular model machine. Then we have within that doing that maintenance properly, so there's maintenance and repair safety precautions, making sure that you get the proper parts on the equipment, and ensuring that the related safety bulletins that come from the manufacturer are addressed. Because if there's a recall on the piece of equipment and you're not dealing with the manufacturer, that will fall through the cracks and you have potential hazards that are in place because you're not properly addressing the maintenance, inspections, and repairs. Then in that plan, we also have the mobile elevated work platform personnel qualifications and training requirements. So again, only trained and authorized personnel are allowed to operate and or occupy the mobile elevated work platform. So within the standards now we end up having operator qualifications and training, and we now have the added element of occupant knowledge. So anybody who's getting in the platform with them has to have the basic knowledge for them to safely work from that work platform. So they need to know that if they're in a boom type lift, they need to be wearing personal fall protection, and that needs to be attached to the proper anchorage, and it needs to be donned properly, meaning adjusted on them properly. They need to know how much weight can go into the platform, that they can't be overloading it. All those elements that are associated with a occupant having the basic knowledge to work safely from the platform. New in there is also a requirement for anyone who is directly supervising a mobile elevated work platform operator to receive training. How can they train them and evaluate them if they don't know what all the rules and regulations are? And then we have more details about retraining that we'll talk about. And again, once someone is generally trained, general training is broad in nature about all equipment, and familiarization is model specific. And as the prior slide said, don't forget that maintenance and repair personnel also need to be provided training. So when it comes to training of personnel, you end up having not just the operators, but occupants and supervisors and maintenance personnel. When we talk about familiarization, now we're stating that we have general operated training, and then you have model-specific familiarization. And I've said this every time I talk on this topic. General operated training is getting your driver's license in a car, is the equivalent of that. And familiarization is saying I rent a car, and I pull out from renting it, and I don't know where the light switch is. I don't know how to turn the speedometer on. I don't know even how to turn the radio on this car. Can't find it because the controls are different. And familiarization is about the controls and specifics about that machine. So even though you're a trained operator, you need to make sure that they are familiarized with the specific machine that they're operating. All of these, as I'm stating, need to be part of this MEWP specific safety use program. I need to have all these in here so I can check them off and making sure that when I'm using this equipment, all of these elements are being addressed. And then before operation, the supervisor of MEWP operations and operators and occupants must be aware of and comply with the requirements of the safe use standard. So you need to read and understand and implement this safe use program. So while you can create this program, if it's sitting on your shelf with an inch of dust on it, it doesn't do anybody any good. So really it is, going over and saying, I'm going to take this and ensure that it is being used. Then we get into the issue of retraining, and have trained and qualified supervisors monitor the performance of the operator to work of the operators in compliance with the standard. So looking at the language that's in here, the user shall designate a qualified person to monitor, supervise, and evaluate operators on a regular basis to ensure their proficiency. So now you get into those questions, which is, how often is a regular basis, and how am I measuring proficiency? And you need to make sure that you have the answers to those questions. So all of these elements that are in place are requirements within the standard that you need to address. Now, I'm going to talk about this as retraining, training. These are elements that are in the OSHA standards, and too often I hear people say, well, OSHA is law and its regulations, and ANSI are voluntary standards, and we don't really have to comply with those. OSHA says that you need to train, but it really doesn't tell you how to train. And when OSHA comes through and does an analysis of did you train properly, these industry standards are really the foundation that OSHA will be using to evaluate, did you do it the right way? Did you train properly? Is retraining being done properly? So these requirements are within the OSHA regulations, and the ANSI standards are providing kind of the meat to the bone of how do I do it? How do I make sure that these things are done properly? So when it comes to retraining, there are new elements within that retraining, such as after an accident, If I have a new employee, if I have new technologies, there are specific requirements that said these are elements that when they occur, retraining should take place. And you need to make sure that those are within your program. Then we get to the broader issue of prevention of unauthorized use of the mobile elevated work platform. Now, obviously the simplest thing is you can remove the key. Those of us who have been in the industry for a long time know that probably half the people in the industry have a key on their key ring for a lot of this equipment. So while at one level you can go over and say, well, at least the people who have a key should be trained. Well, that's an assumption in itself, that they are trained. And then the second assumption is that they're familiarized with that piece of equipment. And lastly is now they're operating a piece of equipment that you have control and custody over. So there are elements that are out there that you need to make sure of that are in place. There are new elements that are available in the marketplace with new telematics that are in here. There's keypads. The PAL card has a smart chip as an example that you can use that says only person who has this card authorized to this category can operate it. And you can even get to the point where that key reader can identify the actual operator number, and you can say only this operator can use this piece of equipment. So there's technology that's out there in the marketplace to enhance your ability to do these things. And aside from just the risk assessment and prevention of unauthorized use, really many of you can identify that when you come into the job the next morning and your equipment isn't there, how much time you lose by not having the equipment there because someone has a key and took it off to use it someplace else. So there's other values in the productivity of following these plans as well. So again, then we get into the safe use of persons not involved with MEWP operations needs to be part of the plan. So, if you go to a job site, it's pretty evident that you're going to go over and see signs that are out there like you see on the screen here, which is construction in progress, stay away from it. So signage is of doing it, barricades, taping it off. But even on the construction job site, when you're doing work and other tradesmen are on the job site working underneath you, keep in mind if you drop something, barricading that area off that's underneath you or having someone working above you. So if you're in the mobile elevated work platform and there's someone working above you with a crane or some other process that's taken place, all of these elements are included in the safety of people not involved with the MEWP operation, and you need to take into consideration all of those elements. And then when you get done with all of this stuff, you say, "Hey, I did it." And then the issue would be, well, if you did it, is it documented? Because if an incident does occur, you know that someone's going to be saying, well, prove it. Prove that you did these things. Within the standard are requirements for record retention. There are various elements that are in place here, which is the transfer of ownership, who owns this machine today, doing the proper inspections, the frequent annual inspections, the pre-delivery preparation service and repairs, training and familiarization, the new element that's out there, which is ongoing operator evaluations. Those need to be accomplished through visual operation at a minimum and must be retained by the user to show that you've been doing these evaluations. Because those evaluations are really the foundation of did retraining need to take place or not. We have the training test. The new standards have more information in those. So they have annexes that are non-compulsory. However, they give you an example of the documentation for testing that should take place. And I would suggest to you that you need to at least reference those by saying, if you're not going to be documenting all the elements in there, you better have a reason why you're not documenting those that the examples in the annexes are giving you. So that documentation becomes much more critical. And the documentation for all the persons trained, which is the MEWP classification, who provided the training, when it was delivered, and familiarization. So there's all of these elements that roll back into that plan that said these things need to take place, and I need to make sure that I'm documenting them, that they're being done. And obviously, if you're going to document them, you want to make sure that you're doing it correctly. So this is how this plan all ties together from, all right, let's have this plan, and let's implement it, and let's document it. So it is a very systemic approach to training. One of the largest changes within the standard is the specific language to require supervisor training. So again, who is a supervisor? They're defined in the standard as an entity, a person assigned by the user, the employer, to monitor operators' performance and supervise their work. And within the standard, the user shall designate a qualified person to monitor, supervise, and evaluate operators on a regular basis to ensure their proficiency. So within the standard, that's the scope of that person's job, and there is a training program that's in place, a requirement in place to see that that's done. So supervisors, do they know what the regulations and standards that apply to mobile elevated work platforms? What is the correct selection of the mobile elevated work platform for the project and task? What an operator must do every day prior to operation? What the known potential hazards associated with the operation of a mobile elevated work platform, and how do you control those, the risk from those potential hazards? What are the different type of MEWP classifications, and what is the required training for those? What is compliant operator training? So to say that you're trained, if someone came and went to the job site and gave you 10 minutes worth of information, is that operator training? And if you answer that yes, you're out of sync with what the real requirements are. And so you need to understand what those requirements are so that you can check the box that you are doing it correctly. And what to look for when evaluating a mobile elevated work platform. So if you're going to be evaluating, what are you looking for? How are you measuring it? And what else do I need to know? So when you're looking at the supervisor training, I would say in the past we went over and said, well, we trained the operator, and that's the finish line. And actually it's the starting point. So the new standards are very systemic in its approach, and here is an assessment of that training that needs to approach to supervisors. There are companies that are out there that are now offering the supervisor training. It's not making them an operator of the equipment, so it's all theoretical knowledge. It can be done online. IPAF has courses, and that can be offered, and there are other companies that have options for that as well. So again, supervisors, the Safe Use Plan task, have trained and qualified supervisors to monitor the work to ensure compliance with provisions of the standards. So they need to understand what the standards are to know if they're being compliant or not. So it really gets into all the details of this Safe Use Plan and all of the elements that need to be done, because they're not just done by that individual. They can be done by the operator. They can be done by someone who's selecting the equipment. There are all those attributes that need to take place. And operators shall comply with the instructions and notify their supervisor if they identify any potential hazards. So again, the supervisor is ingrained within the standard from both oversight, and he is the person who the operators are going to be reporting back to. So this training, again, the standard A92.22 was published in 2018. The standard had a couple of appeals, so there's a limited revision standard that will be coming out. That standard should be published and going into effect March 1st of this year. So both the Safe Use and Training Standard are elements that the supervisor needs to have direct fluency with. So here you can see the 4 specific elements defined within the standard for supervisory training, proper selection, the rules and regulations, potential hazards, and knowledge that the manufacturer's operation manuals are an integral part of that machine, and you need to be following those and stored on the machine. Again, the supervisor training can be done online. You can take it at your convenience. There's no travel. So, supervisor can be all over the, at various job sites. It's available 24/7 where there's internet access available. They can complete them at their own pace. They can do it a section at a time or complete it at one setting. It's highly interactive. In order to have a program that's online that is effective, it needs to have an interactive element to it to keep people engaged with that. So there is an instructor-led option as well, so that people can attend this. IPAF will be sponsoring instructor-led training at ConExpo on March 8th and 9th. So if anyone is attending ConExpo on that Sunday and Monday prior to the actual expo itself, educational programs are going to be taking place, and IPAF on both the 8th and 9th of March during the ConExpo event will be offering instructor-led training. So if anybody has any interest and you're going to be at ConExpo, it'd be a great opportunity to sign up and register. That's on our website for people to register to participate in that supervisor training. So again, www.ipaf.org, and you can register to attend that class. So let's summarize here. All users must adhere to the requirements of the A92.22 Safe Use Standard. So if you have anyone who's operating the equipment, if you're a trainer and you operate the equipment, if you're a rental company and you have drivers who operate it, mechanics who operate it, salespeople operate it, you're a user. If you're a contractor and you have employees who are operating this equipment, you are a user. If you're a manufacturer and you have employees who operate it for any purpose at all, loading, unloading, you're a user. So anyone who's a user must adhere to the requirements of this plan, of this standard, and all users must develop an MEWP specific safe use program, and supervisors, operators, and occupants must be aware of and comply with the safe use standards as incorporated into the safe use program. So that really is the scope of everything that we have. The one thing that I would put out on the table for you is kind of a inexpensive approach, and this is an older slide. You can buy a copy of the ANSI SAIA Manual of Responsibilities, which is an exact copy of the requirements within the Safe Use and Training Standard for $1.50. So if you go to SAIAonline.org at the link that you see there, you can buy a Manual of Responsibilities that is an exact copy of both the Safe Use and Training Standards for $1.50. So I would suggest to anybody who's using this equipment this is an inexpensive way rather than buying the standard. And the only thing different from the standard and the safe use in the Manual of Responsibilities is it eliminates the sections 1 and 2, which are the purpose of the standard and reference documents. So basically you end up having a copy of the standard for $1.50 for both A92.22 and 24. So it's a combined Manual of Responsibility. So there's that website. I'd advise you to get that so that you can have a copy and have your own fluency with it. And then if you have questions, you can go to a resource like IPAF to assist you with helping you understand those. And that concludes the session. So if there are any questions, this would be the appropriate time to bring them forward.
Okay, Tony, it's Stacy. We do have a couple questions that I harvested. Could you just share the difference between A92.2 and A92.20 Type 1 Group B trailer mounted boom? There was a little bit of confusion regarding the definitions and some similarity.
You broke it up a little bit, Stacy, so I'm going to repeat it to make sure that I have the correct question. And that is, what is the requirements for trailer-mounted towable booms?
Yes. Type 1 Group B trailer.
1B. All right, so a towable boom is a 1B. It is a towable machine, and it is covered by the ANSI A92.22 standard, and will continue under that standard. And that means that within that standard, there is no reference to supervisors. There is no reference to occupants. And in some of the elements that we talked about here, they still need to go through all of the evaluations and proper selection of the equipment. So from a fundamental safe use and training perspective, IPAF has taken the position that we will take the most rigid requirements of both of those standards, and that's what we incorporate into our training program. So that would be a 1B piece of equipment, and we would train on that the same way that we train on all other equipment. So where you may have some language in the A92.22 safe use standard or A92.24 training standard that may be a little bit different than what's in the A92.2 standard, they basically are the same. From a design perspective, A92.20 has elements in there that specifically exclude A92.2 equipment. That means that they can design it to that standard, and that is 100% on manufacturers to manufacture to a specific standard. So I would say that the most obvious reason that the A92.2 equipment standard lays different than the other standards is dominantly because it also incorporates insulated aerial devices. So that really is a major theme within that standard, and that is not in the A92 suite of standards, but only in A92.2. So from the majority of safe use and training perspectives, they're very similar, but as I mentioned, there are some elements in the .2 standard that has not been updated to incorporate those differences, such as supervisor training. That being said, you need to have qualified people monitor them to understand if retraining has to be done. So you can argue that the requirements are very similar. They just may not be articulated the same way.
Okay. All right. We do have more questions. When it comes to narrowing down a safe use plan for use across both Canada and the U.S., how do you navigate the many differences between B354 and A92?
Again, I don't know that there are that many safe use variances between the two of them. There are some, but again, I'm going to go back to the basic premise. If I were going to create a safe use plan, I would identify the more rigid requirements in either of the two standards, and I would apply that to both countries in the application of my program.
Okay. What is the ratio of fatal accidents in construction compared to other industries?
Well, again, if I go back to that slide, and I'm going to,
okay,
I'm going to go back up there. So this slide came from a variety of sources, from OSHA to others. construction industries see non-fatal injury rates at 71% higher than any other industry. And you're looking at 1 in 5 or 20% of fatal accidents occur in the construction industry. So you're looking at a major area of concern. Now, obviously, you can argue that the environment that construction workers are in is more hazardous than most industries. But again, I'd go over and just say that the tree care industry has high rates. So there are those industries that, because of the tasks that they're performing, you're going to find, a lot more injuries in the construction industry than you are in the, I'm going to say, financial industry, for obvious reasons. So it really is predicated on how can we control the potential hazards that are associated with the work environment that we're in.
Okay. What is meant by control protection in the new standard?
Well, control protection, it's a method of mitigating or eliminating the potential risk from a hazard. So if you go over and you identify that, okay, I have a power line that's running overhead on this job site. All right, so that's a potential hazard. Well, what's the risk from it? Well, if I'm on the opposite side of the site and in my task and proximity to it, don't have it, the risk from that hazard are very low. If I'm in an alleyway and it's down and I have to ride by that, the risk now increase. And so what is the method? What's the control measure I'm going to put in place to make sure that I don't have the risk from that hazard? So it really is saying, what is I'm going to do in place? Am I going to put up barricades? Am I going to have someone who is a groundman to identify when they're getting close to that work environment? Because sometimes the work that we have to do may bring us to a point where we may need to get closer than what we would like to be. So again, the new standards say that based on the nominal voltage, you need to stay at least 10 feet away. And I always use this as a reference point. When we looked at accidents in the 1990s for electrocutions, where we needed to stay at least a minimum approach distance away based on voltage, out of the electrocutions that occurred with mobile elevated work platforms, 50% of the bodies were in contact with the power source. So when you put into place what is the control measure, the fact that we have a standard in place and we train them to stay a distance away from it, the fact that 50% of the bodies were in contact with the power source said the control measure of giving them training wasn't enough. The control measure of telling them wasn't enough. So what's the control you're going to put in place based on the knowledge that we have to mitigate that hazard?
Okay, thank you. Another question. As a manufacturer, we are required to provide the latest manual responsibilities with each machine. Are the A92.22 24 versions available now from SAIA, and are they going to meet the requirements come March 1st in 2020?
Well, the answer is that the A92 suite of standards has been published in 2018, and a manual of responsibilities for those for A92.20 and 22 have been printed and have been made available in the industry. Simultaneously, the standards had appeals. Those appeals were approved by ANSI, which requires a limited revision to those standards, which means that prior to them going into effect, a new standard must be published, and when it's published, it will likely go into effect immediately, and that immediacy was March 1st. As that standard has not been published, I would speculate that the manual of responsibilities that will address that new requirements within the change for those limited revisions is not available. So you're kind of between, I could put the existing manual responsibilities, which were available. I know that we as IPAF have purchased hundreds of copies of them for distribution and reference. And I know that other companies have been buying them and putting them on their fleets so they don't have to do it, the day that implementation or the effectivity date goes into place. So there would be the question that I would say you'd have to call the Secretariat, SAIA, to get any specific answers broader than what I've just put on the table for you, because what is available is the 2018 published Standard Manual of Responsibilities.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Our company uses a JSA form prior to operations. Would that be considered a risk assessment?
Well, a job safety analysis, JHA, maybe, but it could also be too general in nature. So I don't know what your JSA form is, but again, if I go to what the standard stipulates, it is you need to have a MEWP specific safe use program, and that incorporates a risk assessment. That risk assessment can be done appropriately from a JHS, a job site assessment. But again, I can't say that the form that you have is specific enough to mobile elevated work platforms that it is or is not appropriate.
Okay. Here's another question. Under the new standards, what qualifications make up a qualified service technician inspector for the annual equipment inspections?
Well, it's a real good question, and I would say that the standards say that they must be trained by a qualified person, and they must be qualified to perform the work on each model that they're working on. How you accomplish that is not stated within the standard, outside of they must be trained by a qualified person and they must be qualified to work on the specific models that they're authorized to work upon. So I'd go over and just say that if you have someone who's been trained as a mechanic and they've been trained by a manufacturer and they've been trained on given models, and then you end up having a new machine coming in like a 185 boom lift, is the fact that they've been trained and working on all other models make them qualified to work on that? I would speculate, I would say no, personally, unless they receive additional information and training from the manufacturer. So that's, again, model specific. So even though you have somebody who may have been working on this equipment for years, doesn't make them necessarily qualified to work on all machines and all models. In fact, they've been working on all machines and all models. The fact that one day you bring in an atrium lift, completely different technology, are they qualified to work on that? I think you could, in your own mind, answer that question of what would it take to make that person with their already existing skills qualified to perform that task. That would be what you would need to do and have in your program to validate your answer being yes, they are qualified to do that or not.
Okay. All right. The accident statistics that you used from today's presentation, is there a specific resource? And then is there a general reference that we can go to for additional review of any stats?
Well, the one for mobile elevated work platforms specifically, the answer is that IPAF does MEWP-specific analysis. And we look at the prior year, and I'll give you an example because I do the sourcing for incidents in the U.S. You can go to OSHA's website for their fatal accident reporting. It's called their FATCAT report. And there they'll have a report that shows you of all 4,500 plus fatal accidents that occur every year. I have to go through that report to identify those that are aerial lift specific. There is a way of doing a search on aerial specific accidents, and you can go through those, and even when you read those, sometimes while they're putting into an aerial lift incident, it's not an aerial lift, so you have to be able to read them and analyze them. This is what IPAF does with all these incidents. And because of the timing of the reporting, it's public information, it's probably 9 months after the end of the year before the prior year's information is fully accessible from OSHA for us to utilize. Outside of that, and then we take that information, we have to do analytics on it. Because of the way that we do the reporting, it's all confidential on the reporting. So what we provide is analytics to the data, and that generally is available on our website, and it's normally at least a year behind. So, right now we have, 2018's information that we'll be providing a report on, and 2019's information we won't have done till the end of 2020. The rest of the data you can find from various sources. So the Bureau of Labor Statistics has data. You have to almost go through with a fine-tooth comb to find the information that really is pertinent to our industry, because when you're looking at that general information, it's on all incidents, on all equipment, on all types of accidents. And while some of it generally is interesting and applies, some of it is too broad to think that it applies specifically to mobile elevated work platforms. So that's why IPAF has very MEWP-specific information. We encourage all of you who are listening to go to our website anytime you're aware of an incident, and those incidents can be fatal incidents or just accidents that are not fatal incidents. Because when you get to the point where you end up having accident data that is fatal, accident data that's not fatal, that's serious, and then accidents that occur or near misses. Those near misses are elements that are out there that truthfully no one reports on, and we don't have. We are doing a research project in the UK, whereas all IPAF members report all incidents. That we utilize that data to get much more detail, because we have our members there agreeing to do all that reporting. So if they have an incident in the shop, it can be a cut, scrape, near miss. That's where we'll see that information that's probably much more important. It's where we have identified issues of loading and unloading being a very serious issue for our industry, but normally not fatal accidents, but there are a lot of accidents that occur in that regard. And until we get to the point where our industry reports those things, and we have that information, we can't take appropriate action on that information. But IPAF has it on our websites, and again, you have to go through to ferret out through all the data that's out there to find the information that really is of value to our industry.
Okay, thank you. And I've got one more question. Are the manuals for ANSI SAIA, are they available in other languages, do you know? And is there any plan for that if they're not?
To the best of my knowledge, they are only available in English. You could check with the Secretariat. I mean, I am a chairman for the standards. To my knowledge, they are not available in any other language outside of English.
Okay. All right. Thank you. That is the end of our questions at this time. Tony, back to you.
Let's see. We have people who were operated trained in 2000. We have big investment. Do they need to be trained again completely, or can they be trained in areas where we have changed the new standards? So you didn't ask that question.
Thank you. Nope, just came in. Go ahead. Go ahead.
And it's a great, it really is a very important Q&A issue, and that is that people who are trained in compliance with ANSI's existing standards that do not call for an operator to deliver occupant knowledge, as an example. when the new standards come out, those people will be non-compliant as a trained operator because they will not be compliant with the most current requirements within the safe use and training standard. So the issue is, and I go back to the definition of retraining. Retraining is based on the observation of the employer. Those things that will take a previously trained employee to the point where they are competent again. And that would mean that you can provide the knowledge that you have identified that is missing and add that in and document that so that they are now compliant with the new standard. So again, IPAF has put into their new training course all the elements that are required within that standard. So it talks about occupant knowledge. It talks about the new requirement that says you need to stay at least 10 feet away. IPAF's training says you need to stay at least 20 feet away. So our standards are either more rigid in being compliant with the requirements within the standard, but again, if you have not trained them on the delivery of occupant knowledge, that element can be delivered to them, and on top of the training that they have already received, which is compliant with the standard, would make them compliant with the new standard. So hopefully I've answered that question sufficiently.
Okay, absolutely. Okay, I think we have exhausted all the questions. I wanted to thank everyone for joining us and thank Tony for being our presenter. Tony, are there any other final words you want to share before we close out the webinar?
The only thing I would add in is that from a timing perspective, I'll let you know exactly what is known today, which is in the development of standards, it has to go through some very defined processes. And those processes include public access to commenting on standards, in addition to the consensus body who develops and reviews those. Those comments come in, they have to be addressed. If they are not addressed to the satisfaction of the commenter, they have the availability to appeal the standards. The limited revision standard was sent out. Comments were only allowed to be provided on the revisions, those limited revisions that were put in place. We have many non-resolved comments that have been addressed. They have to, I believe it's the 18th of January, to place an appeal. So there could be an additional appeal to the standards that have been put out, which could in reality delay the actual publication and hence the effective date of March 1st. My personal belief is that the standard body has done everything that it possibly can to comply with ANSI's requirements of due process. So even though someone could appeal it, my own premise would be that I don't think that there's any validity to an appeal winning, and the standards as they have been presented will go into effect at some date, and hopefully it will be March 1st. So I would state that those standards are, if you have the 2018 standard, the variations in the new limited revisions are very specific to, I'm going to say, technical issues, which is we can't go over and say that you had to have the ANSI SAIA manual responsibilities. You have to have a manual responsibilities or its equivalent. When it came to revisions, you had to have language. The prior language said you had to have the approval of the manufacturer, and the new language says you must have the approval of the manufacturer or an equivalent entity. So the requirements are fundamentally the same, but the details of how you would apply those in those very limited examples are the changes that will take place. And so you can implement your training, you can implement a safe use program, knowing that there are some very limited changes that are going to take place with the revision.
Okay.
So hopefully I answered that question.
I think you did. By the way, there's a nice comment from one of our participants that says, "Thank you, Tony, Man of the Year." So,
well,
anyway.
Thank you. So again, there was a comment over there. This presentation will be available online on our website. Is that
correct? Yes, that is correct. We'll provide a link to the recording to everyone who is on this webinar and anyone else who would want it who is in membership. Okay. All right.
And my contact information, I'm going to go to the end again, so it has it, and that's that. If you have ongoing questions, IPAF's mission is to promote the safe and effective use of powered access equipment. So, boom. If you have questions moving forward, you have my contact information. There is our website. We have lots of information that's available on our website. On our website, we do have some white paper. So if you went in to do a web search on our link and you put in and just said ANSI white papers, it will provide you with a detailed list of some of the significant changes that have occurred in both the design standard, the safe use standard, and the training standard. And our training centers are set in having access to new training courses that are compliant to all of the new standards for operators and supervisors. So both of those trainings are there and available. So thank you all for your attention. Hopefully we provide you some information that's of value. And if you have any questions, you have my contact information that's there, and I'll assist you as best we can.
Okay. Thank you very much, Tony, and thank you, participants. Please keep an eye out for an email that will have the link to our recording, and check out ipaf.org/events for our future events. Have a great week, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Stacy.